I say to people in the global north, right? If all of us in the global south were to enjoy the same consumption patterns that you folks take for granted in the global north, we'll need between 5 and 8 planets to do that. So we have one planet. We need to redefine our notion of even what constitutes a meaningful, happy, and good life.
My guest this episode is a distinguished Kumi Naidoo, a human rights and climate justice activist. Naidoo first began his journey at the age of 15, fighting against the then apartheid government in South Africa by organizing school boycotts. He was arrested several times for civil disobedience, and when the government imposed a state of emergency, he was forced to go underground and flee to the UK, where he became a Rhodes Scholar. He eventually returned to South Africa in 1990 when Mandela was released from jail and went on to play a vital role in shaping the then African National Congress. His steadfast work in the human rights and justice sphere led him to become the first person from the Global South to head Greenpeace International and later become Secretary General of Amnesty International. From scaling oil rigs to protest against the fossil fuel industry to sitting down with the likes of Tony Blair, Angela Merkel, and Putin, Naidoo has become one of the prominent voices in the climate justice movement. He continues to represent Africans rising for justice, peace, and dignity as a global ambassador and currently holds a position of distinguished visiting lecturer at Stanford University Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Before we jump into the conversation, please do subscribe and rate the podcast on whichever platform you're listening to it. Welcome, Kumi. It's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been curious, considering the Indian diaspora is among the biggest communities in the world, while much of that focus is centered on those who reside in the West. We don't know much about the community in South Africa, considering that Gandhi started his freedom struggle there. Could you share a little bit about your upbringing, especially at a time when apartheid was rife?
So, one of the features of the apartheid system from 1948 was breaking down communities that were having people of different races living together, and we had what was called the Group Areas Act, which meant that people of different groups would live in different areas. So people were forcibly removed from communities that they had lived for in decades. So I grew up in one such township, which was called Chatsworth, and my dad was a bookkeeper. My mum was used to sew clothing at home, and so pretty humble upbringings. And then when I was about 15, sadly, my mum committed suicide, and that was a very catalytic event in my life. It was also at the same time that the first big national student uprising in the 1980s would take place. And I was 15 years old at that time, got involved in that struggle. And the push there was for equality in the education system. I jokingly tell a story that we didn't at 15 understood everything that was going on. But so the slogan at the front of the march was, "We want equality." By the time the slogan got to the back of the march, the younger kids were chanting, "We want a colored TV," because they thought that was a slogan at the front of the march. And I say, probably at that time, I wanted equality and a colored TV almost equally, and both were equally unattainable at that point in my life. So that first protest against the inequality in the education system led to me being suspended from school and all of that, and was almost like the suspension was like an encouragement to get more actively involved. So I was very involved in mobilizing opposition to the apartheid system in the community where I grew up, as well as beyond. And that finally led me to need to go into exile. And at the age of 22, I was very privileged in the sense that I had just got a Rhodes Scholarship before that. So I fled, but I got to Oxford and started working on a PhD. And when Mandela was released, I was back on a plane within 1 month of his release to go and see how I could contribute to what was happening at home, and then contributed to the transition in different ways, and then made the decision not to go into government because we had a joke in the period following the first democratic election. We used to say the term NGO no longer stood for non-governmental organization, but stood for next government official, because so many people from the NGO community went into government. So I stayed out, helped addressing one of the key injustices of the apartheid system, which left the majority of our people unable to read and write, and led the adult literacy movement, and then eventually became the head of the South African NGO Coalition, which was the body that would unite all the civil society groups and to figure out how to engage with the new democratic government. So, with the Indian community specifically, community played a big role in the liberation struggle. You know, there were lots. The ANC was driven by a framework called non-racialism, which said that it didn't matter what your race was. If you want to stand up and fight for the struggle, there was room. So you had lots of very prominent activists that came from within the Indian community in South Africa, in the trade union movement, in the ANC, in civil society more broadly. And so that is not to say that the majority of the people of Indian origin were strongly in the liberation struggle, but large numbers of them were.
Okay. And having been, quite one of the forefront members of ANC and to see where it is now, what do you feel about it?
I feel desperately sad, desperately sad. I feel it's a betrayal of the many, many people that lay down their lives for our liberation. We have industrial scale looting, not simply corruption, like industrial. Sadly, in this story of corruption, there's an Indian family called the Guptas that arrived from India in the early 1990s, were able to befriend the political leadership of the ANC, and were actually the key part of being able to engage in massive theft at our electricity utility called ESCOM, in our transport parastatals, and so on. And they've fled the country now, and they are fugitives from the law from South Africa, living in Dubai or somewhere. And so, yes, I feel desperately sad. But on the other hand, I see young people in South Africa fighting back, trying to present alternatives, and so on. And therein lies my optimism. But the reality is that Mandela's legacy has been betrayed by the current leadership of the ANC, and they've put their own interests before the people's interests.
It seems like from my knowledge, I could say the only good thing right now the South African government did was to bring the Palestine government to the ICJ, International Court of Justice. And for that, they've got so much pat on the back, I would say. For you, someone who's been a human rights activist and anti-apartheid activist for so many decades, and you see something like that happening in Palestine, something so similar, genocide is taking place, and so many lives are at stake. Unlike in South Africa, one of the reasons that apartheid regime came to an end was because there was some amount of international support towards the end, whether there was some, bans or sanctions being put on the government. But none of that seems to be happening with the Palestine, at least not to the scale that it should be happening. What are your thoughts on it? Would you think a resolution is possible?
Well, first, I should tell you that, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there were three conflicts in the world that was often compared and contrasted: the Northern Ireland conflict, South Africa, and the Palestinian Israeli conflict. And most people used to say that probably South Africa would be the last one to be resolved, because the contradictions and the scale of the numbers and so on would mean that South Africa would be the last one. And so the fact that today, of those three conflicts, the Palestinian Israeli conflict is the one that continues to be the one that's furthest away from a solution, I would say is as a direct result of the fact that certain powerful countries, particularly the United Kingdom and the United States and parts of Europe, because they carry the guilt of what Europe had done to the Jewish community. And they take that guilt and punish the Palestinian people. And they've allowed this very corrupt regime of Benjamin Netanyahu, whose leadership making genocidal comments such as these are human animals and so on, referring to the people of Gaza. And so I would put that one observation. Secondly, I would say that it's really important that we recognize that there's history to this conflict. You know, it's not as if October 7th, the horrific attack on October 7th, I don't support that, the taking of civilian lives, and I condemn it in the strongest possible term, whether it's done by the Israeli state, and I call that Israeli state terrorism, or whether it's done by any organization that is legitimately part of the resistance. I really feel that the taking of civilian life is undermining of the cause, right? Having said that, it's so interesting that especially the United Kingdom and the United States that have played a major role in defending human rights abuses by the Israeli state over time, and particularly Britain carries the responsibility of the historical responsibility of the mess that we find ourselves in the sense that, you know, during the First World War already, they were promising the Palestinian people a state on the one hand, and then on the other, they were speaking to the Zionists and promising them that, you know, the state of Israel could be created on the same land. And so the duplicity of Britain, and by the way, British colonialism carries, and European colonialism generally, but British colonialism in particular, many conflicts happening in the world today, if you look at its roots, the hands of the injustice of British colonialism has its hands there. The third point I want to make is this. Nelson Mandela told us when he came out of prison, he said, South Africans will never be free until the Palestinian people are free. This is something, these words of Mandela were taken very seriously by many of us. And there's been a strong solidarity that's existed between the two struggles. Now, what are the similarities, you say? So, firstly, we fought a system of apartheid in South Africa, and right now, the United Nations and various human rights bodies, almost all the major human rights bodies, both within Israel as well as outside of Israel, have, without any reasonable doubt, have shown that the Israeli state practices on a very sophisticated basis a system of apartheid, which is denying people the same rights on the basis of religion or language and so on. And so, firstly, that's been established that the Israeli system of governance is a apartheid system, right? And that I would say was well established a couple of years ago. And then when October 7th happens, it's very interesting that Britain, US, and many other European governments have sought to imagine that this conflict started on 7th of October, right? And to negate the history. You know, people forget some basic facts. There's an interview, for example, with Golda Meir, the former prime minister of Israel, where she says there was no Palestinians and Israelis before. It was Arabs and Jewish people and Christian people, of course, living together, and they were all Palestinians. Shimon Peres and so on, when they arrived there as young kids, all traveled on Palestinian passports. And she, in that interview, says, I've traveled on a Palestinian passport and I am Palestinian, you know. So it'll be good for you to find it. I can send it to you to play it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
So in a way, both the Palestinian people and the Israeli people are both victims of the history of colonialism and how colonial power used divide and rule for its own, you know, selfish economic and other interests. So today, you know, when we look at what the South African government did, it is the spirit of Mandela that drove that. It is the spirit of the South African people as a whole who have had a sense of solidarity with the injustice that was meted out since 1948. And by the way, 1948 is also a very important year for South Africans, because in 1948 is when the apartheid party comes to power. That's when apartheid formally becomes a system. And also, just for the record, the Israeli state and the apartheid state in South Africa collaborated in many, many ways as two pariahs in the world, if you want. And, like, for example, even the exchanging of the latest information or practicing torture were the kinds of things that, how can you torture and kill potentially, but where there's no evidence left, so that there won't be any repercussions.
That's shocking.
Yeah, no, all of these things were happening, and there's evidence of all of this historically documented. So in the current moment, though, and I just want to make this point, right? We also, for far too long now, anybody who stands up for the violations of the human rights of Palestinian people, it's like a terrifying thing to do, because you immediately are shouted down as being anti-Semitic, right? So for us in South Africa, one thing that people must know is that we have a very significant Jewish community in South Africa. And of course, some of them are very much anything that Israel does, any human rights violations that Israel does, they would defend it. But if you look at the Jewish community as a whole, some of the most prominent voices for justice for the Palestinian people comes from within the Jewish community in South Africa. This is people who were with us in the liberation struggle and had rejected apartheid. And they said, if we reject apartheid here in South Africa, we have to reject apartheid in Israel or wherever else it happens. And in this moment of pain that all of us are witnessing as we see this horrific set of genocidal actions by the Israeli state in Gaza, it's very important that we remind ourselves that, if it was the other way around, you can imagine how the so-called international community, because let me just say the term international community is very abused, right? It's used in a very opportunistic way, and usually used for when China and India can be, which together constitute one third of the world's population, cannot be included in a lot of the conversations when, particularly U.S. and European politicians use use that term. So it is true, though, what you say, that many South Africans feel the same way. Actually, that after a very long time, the South African government honored the legacy of Mandela and did something that took a measure of moral courage, and did it in a very competent and professional. And I think, many people in the global South, not just in South Africa, I've had emails from people all over the world saying, like, thank you for what your country did, and so on. And let's hope, anyway, those actions stop the horrific killing of people in Gaza, and the horrific acts of genocide. And I also, at the same time, hope equally that hostages that are being held are released soon. They are civilians, and they should be back home with their families.
Right. Yeah. I'm hoping there's a ceasefire immediately.
Absolutely. And just on that, right? If we look at how the United States has exercised its veto power at the Security Council, it has been horrendously painful to see. And the Democratic President Joe Biden runs the risk of losing the election come November, because many Democrats, those of the Jewish faith as well as those of different faiths, who oppose the funding of the Netanyahu regime in the way that it's happening, and want to see justice for the Palestinians. And let's be blunt about it. There's no military solution to this issue. All of this acts of violence that have been meted out since October 7th against unarmed, defenseless children and women and so on. And, all of this, all it's doing is creating a much more stronger resistance to the Israeli actions, and so on. So it's backfiring really badly. And by the way, your question started is about the international response.
Yeah.
I can tell you this from my observation that I don't remember any time in history that I can reflect on that the Palestinian cause and the legitimacy of the Palestinian cause has such a high level of recognition and and legitimacy as it has today. I cannot remember, and basically Benjamin Netanyahu and his group of genocidal leaders around him, right? I'm not saying all of them are like that, but there are people in his core leadership, right? They are essentially become the biggest recruiters, in fact, of both international solidarity for the Palestinian cause as well as domestic resistance to it. From my experience as a young activist in the anti apartheid struggle, I can tell you that for every life that was taken by the apartheid regime, the commitment to the struggle grew more and more because more and more people were losing families and losing loved ones and seeing the injustice of what was happening. And they reach a point, like I reached as a young person, where you say, I'm happy to put my life on the line if necessary. I mean, not that we wanted to die, but we said the scale of the cause is so big that thousands and thousands of us were willing to say, you know, we're prepared to make the ultimate sacrifices if that's what it takes to liberate. If a people do not have basic dignity, as the Palestinians have been systemically denied for decades and decades and decades, people will stand up and fight. And and I'm not, while I don't legitimize every single way in which people might fight, the cause of Palestinian statehood is a just cause, and nobody can deny that today.
Yes, I hope so. And soon there will be, some amount of resolution to this conflict. It's been going on for decades. You've been a human rights activist, like as I mentioned before, for so many decades. And you also started, you entered into climate and environmental issues. Was it mainly through Greenpeace, or that journey started earlier for you?
I'll tell you a story. When I was 22 years old, I was fleeing South Africa into exile. And one of my best friends at that time, Lenny Naidoo, same surname, no relation. And he basically asked me this question. He said, Kumi, what is the biggest cause? What is the biggest sacrifice we can make for the cause of humanity? And I said, oh, that's a simple question. It's giving your life. Because at that time, every other weekend, we were at funerals burying comrades that had been killed by the apartheid regime. And he said, no, that's the wrong answer. It's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life. I was 22 years old at that time. My friend Lenny was way ahead of us. And I jokingly say at that time he was probably only one of 5,000 voluntary vegetarians on the entire African continent. He was somebody who got the intersection between racial injustice and environmental injustice. And unfortunately, I must confess that even though he was talking to us about it, I didn't have the wisdom in my teenage years to fully understand it. But the roots were planted by my friend Lenny. And then as I became more and more active in the anti-poverty movement globally, I was the chair of something called Global Call to Action Against Poverty. You might know it as the organizing slogan was Make Poverty History. In India, we have a chapter called Vada Todo, Don't Break Your Promises. That's the umbrella in India for it. And while I was in that work in the leadership of the global anti-poverty movement, I was seeing how the environmental breakdown that we were seeing and climate impact specifically were having an impact on some of the efforts that we were making to improve people's lives. So in Bangladesh, for example, if you did a big development project on the coastline of Bangladesh, right? Today, the sea level rise is already contaminating the groundwater table in the coastal parts of Bangladesh, making agriculture where agriculture was easily possible in the past not possible. So if you invested a huge amount of resources in trying to address the economic development of people living there and ignore the fact that the sea level is rising and is going to contaminate the water sources, for example, means that, you know, you are not understanding the power of intersectionality, by which I mean, by the way, this is a wisdom given to us by the feminist movement decades and decades ago, and we stupidly chose to ignore it, right? And when I look at how the response to injustice is framed at the campaigning level, you got Amnesty doing human rights, Greenpeace and WWF doing environment, Oxfam doing poverty, and so on.
It was all in silos.
Silos, exactly. We have to
Yeah.
break that silo mentality, and we need to say to those organizations, some of whom I have served, that it's critically important that you understand that for ordinary people, there's not one part of the life which is environment, another part of the body that is social, another part of it which is, on something else. And so, unless we can understand that people are integrated in their lives and respond in that way. So, when I joined Greenpeace, the first month, almost all the interviews that I did with media folks around the world, because there was a bit of a buzz about it, because sadly I was the first person from the global south to ever lead the organization, even though it had been around for more than 4 decades already at that time. And the question I got asked, you asked it in a very nice way. The question I got asked was like this: so you've been in the human rights and anti-poverty movement all your life. You're leaving those struggles now to go and fight the climate struggle. And my answer then was, my answer was, the struggle to address human rights and poverty on the one hand, and the struggle to prevent catastrophic, runaway, irreversible climate change can, must, and should be seen as two sides of the same coin, right? They are completely connected. If we look at what's happening today, when there's an extreme weather event, for example, it is the poor that suffer the most. The vulnerability of the poor, where the infrastructure is not good, where the emergency services are not good, and so on, means that we are seeing so many lives lost, as a result of climate events. If you look at Pakistan, for example, you know, you can have one, we have seen twice it's happened now in the last, I think, 10, 15 years. You can have such massive flooding that 20 million people in one flood can be displaced from their homes, for example, you know. And so, and of course, we see climate impacts in India and all in China. We're seeing now, the critics or the doubters will say, we've always had floods, we've always had droughts, we've always had typhoons, we've always had cyclones, and so on. But there cannot be any debate any longer that the frequency, the ferocity, the velocity, the scale of it is way off the charts, way off the charts. And we don't actually, even today, need the science to tell us that climate change is a real threat. We just have to open our eyes and watch the weather bulletins from around the world, and you can see the kind of extreme things that are happening. And, to the last thing I would say here is that, when we talk about intersectionality, it's also about another intersectionality that we need to look at is how the secular world engages with the world of faith, right? And sometimes organizations that were campaigning on, say, climate kind of took a ultra secular approach, right? And didn't seek to engage and figure out ways of working with movements of faith. I have no doubt in my mind that unless the faith community globally of all Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and all the other religions, right, including, smaller communities of faith, including Rastafarianism, right, all of these faith communities, right, have a critical role to play right now to actually bring their voice to address the biggest challenge that humanity faces. See, climate change is different from many of the other struggles that we have faced. So if you take, for example, gender equality, which we have been fighting for decades and decades and decades, you could even say centuries, right? It is sad that after so much of sacrifice and so on, that we have such a low level of gender equality in the world today, and that there's so many injustices that women have to face, right? But with gender equality, there isn't a clock in the middle of the table that's ticking away and saying, you have to get it done by 2030. Otherwise, it's irreversible, runaway, catastrophic climate change, and so on. And so climate change should refocus us in fundamental ways. But I'll just conclude by saying that climate change is not an environmental issue. Climate change is a cross-cutting issue. It's the issue of our economy, our energy system, our food system, our transport system, and so on. And the good news is the solutions to address it are known, and what those that are dragging the feet need to recognize that we cannot change the science. All we can change is political will. And thankfully, political will in many cases is a renewable resource, if you know what I mean. People can be voted out of power.
Right. But do you think people are starting to understand that intersectionality? Like, the Earth Commission report, which brought out one last year, last year, it's, one of the third paper, Earth System Boundaries, it mentioned the introduction of justice into the definition of planetary boundaries. So are people still grappling with it? And if they've understood it, will the privileged people really, are ready to change the status quo?
Well, I think they're not, right? They need to be made to change the status quo. And the reality is the overwhelming majority of people in the world are actually on the receiving end of this addiction to fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas, right? And just because we are not there yet doesn't mean that we are necessarily far away from it. Because if I look at when I started, 20, 30 years ago, beginning to understand we need to act on climate and on the environment more broadly, I can tell you there were very, very fewer people that were having that consciousness. Today, there's no question from India to South Africa, the levels of consciousness on the threat that climate change constitutes and the way it intersects with our economic system and so on is understood by a much larger number of people, significantly larger number of people, but still an insufficient number of people. Insufficient because the scale of change that we need to make needs to ensure that this effort mobilizes the largest number of people in global history to push very powerful vested interests, as you correctly locate in the question, who will not change unless pressure is brought to them. And here's where the tragedy is, right? Do you know who were the first people who understood the threat of climate change and how the burning of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas contributed to climate change? Do you know who the first people who understood it the best? Not the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but actually it was the oil companies, right? Because their own researchers were telling them, you know, that this is causing a problem, right? And guess what they did? Rather than being honest, admitting what was happening, on the one hand, they spent billions and billions of dollars contaminating the public debate around it, saying that it was not a big issue and so on. But on the other hand, when they were building their rigs in the sea for exploration and extraction of oil from the sea, guess what they did? They built it much higher and they took into account the science, what their scientists were telling them that it was real, that one of the implications is sea level rise. And let's just be real, for a country like India, for example, right, where you have significant numbers of people living on your coastlines, right, both on the East Coast and West Coast, we are talking about, hundreds of millions of people, or at the very minimum, you could say tens of millions of people whose lives are actually at risk, where everything that is dear to them, where their ancestors are buried, where they fish from the ocean and make livelihoods and all of that is under threat. And unfortunately, too many governments around the world, in the global south as well, who are paying lip service to climate change rather than acting with the urgency that the situation calls for.
Yeah. In fact, I live in a coastal city. It's called Chennai. I'm not sure if you've been here, but
I have. And my roots are in that part of the world.
oh, wonderful. So every year, the monsoon comes during the months of October, November, December. But for the past few years, like how you mentioned earlier, it's become more furious, much more destruction, and it's really there for everyone to see the kind of havoc it causes every year nowadays. In fact, we look at those monsoon season with a little bit of anxiousness now. Yeah.
But I hear about good things coming out of the people in various countries around the world. And in India, for example, as well as globally, if you think about how we move people to understand, part of the problem around climate change activism is climate change activism itself, right? Let me explain what I mean by that. We talk in a language that's very scientific, policies, proposals, rational stuff, and so on, right? That goes over the heads of 99.99% of people in the world, right? And I'm going to give you a simple example, right? So when I was at Greenpeace, I occupied an oil rig in Greenland, right? And I was arrested, and 2 weeks later, I'm back in South Africa. But I'm reminded while I'm going on this inflatable boat to go and occupy this oil rig that was owned by a British company that was trying to prospect. In that case, they did not succeed, and that effort was stopped as a result of partly as a result of our protest. And so, I'm in this little inflatable boat, and you can see it on YouTube if you
I've
just do
seen it actually.
Kumi Greenpeace Green, and you can see how scared I am. If you look at it, you can see I'm sitting on this boat looking really scared. And then I had this horrible thought, that if this was the last time I was able to stand up for justice and do the right thing, 99% of the people back home in Africa, friends, colleagues, family, and so on, wouldn't understand the placard that I was carrying. It just said, "Stop Arctic destruction," right? And so I ended up, in prison there for about a week. And my brother in South Africa goes on national television in South Africa to kind of mobilize support to get me out of prison. And he gets asked this question. He gets asked, "So tell me, what exactly was Kumi doing there in the Arctic?" And my brother, who's a internationally renowned optometrist and a person in public health, he says, I must be honest with you, I don't have a clue what exactly the whole Arctic issue is. But all I can say is that if Kumi took a risk to do this action, it must be really important because he cannot swim to save his backside, right? And so, anyway, I think, stop Arctic destruction didn't mean anything. So when I get back home to South Africa, one of the kids in the family says, "Uncle Kumi, what a terrible slogan, stop Arctic destruction. Nobody understood what you're talking about. You guys are always talking to yourselves." Right? Then I said, "Okay, darling, what would be a better slogan?" And she says, "Save Santa Claus now." But can you see the brilliance of
Yes.
what you were saying?
Yeah.
That sometimes activism projects its own consciousness on people rather than understanding where people are at and actually building on that consciousness. So what you're saying is, listen, the only association that ordinary people have with the Arctic is that Santa Claus is chilling out there, and connect with that. Now, I should say, I told this story at a breakfast at the German Parliament in 2023, I believe, or 2022. Sorry, in 2022, and a very concerned German parliamentarian came up to me afterwards and said, "Kumi, I just want to check. You do know that Santa Claus doesn't exist, right?" So yes, I do know Santa Claus does. But if you were to look at that story and put it in the context of activism more generally, right? Whether it's on gender and so on, we make the same mistake. We aim our messages and our narratives at the brain. Facts, figures, science, rationality, and so on. And if you look what Donald Trump and the people around him in the US do, not only do they just tell huge amounts of lies and create alternative realities, but they ignore the head completely. They're not focused on the head. They go straight for the gut and the heart, right? Now, I'm not saying that activism must abandon facts, but we don't have to be as boring as we are. We need to be able to reach people and move them. And how do you move people? How do you move people when so many people are not excluded from the digital, you know, information superhighway because of the digital divide and also the scientific stuff? Even if you were educated, like my brother is, it's not always easy to understand if you're not involved in it on a day-to-day basis. So one of the things that I've landed on is recognizing for years now that we have to bring the power of arts, culture, and activism, what we call artivism, together to shift and move people. So in India, for example, when you have so many people who are educationally disadvantaged, right? They are struggling to survive on a day-to-day basis just to get food on the table for their families to eat. To have time to even think about how to resist the system, right, is a luxury. And then, even if you had the time, then the world of activism is not inviting you easily in and giving you as many ramps to enter, right? Because we are using a language that's alienating and so on. So, and if you look at successful campaigning and mobilization in India, arts and culture is used on a tremendous basis, right? And so, like in India, for example, there's an initiative that I'm I'm on the board of an organization called UN Live Museum of the United Nations. And one of the initiatives that they're working on is a film project with people in India called DOPE, right? DOP, called Defenders of Planet Earth. And I encourage people to go and find out more about it and see how they can support it and be engaged there.
Okay, that's interesting. That actually brings me to the next question. We see how climate activists go and throw soup on Mona Lisa, and they've done other disruptive antics. Do you think that kind of civil disobedience goes beyond just grabbing eyeballs? Does it actually make an impact on the elite change makers?
So the very fact that you're asking the question, right, means that it does have an impact, right? But whether the impact is one that actually delivers significant change and meaningful change is a bit more of a question mark. But let's say something about civil disobedience, right? If we look at the history of humanity, right, when humanity was faced with a terrible injustice, right, or a terrible challenge, those struggles only moved forward when decent women and men stood up and said, enough is enough and no more. We're prepared to put our lives on the line. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary. So, and if we look at, Gandhi as a figure, for example, and in fact, the truth is one of the biggest inspirations to civil disobedience as a legitimate tactic, especially peaceful civil disobedience, or what growing up as a young person, we used to say, satyagraha, right? You know, these, India plays a big part through Gandhi in giving that to the world. Even if you look at Martin Luther King in the United States in the civil rights movement, he acknowledged that he was involved, inspired a lot by Gandhi's, contribution. So I don't make any apologies for supporting civil disobedience. However, civil disobedience is a tool in the activist toolbox, or in the toolbox for justice, right? It has always been there. It will always be there, because when people are suffering such injustice and exclusion, civil disobedience sometimes is the only option to express their anger, even if it means that their lives will be lost in the process, right? But like any tool in the toolbox for justice, you can't use a tool too frequently, or because it'll get blunted, or use it unstrategically, or use it in the same way, in different places, as if the context in different places are the same. So we need to understand that civil disobedience is fundamentally contextual. Let me give you an example. I'm not sure whether many of your listeners will be familiar with the term mooning. Okay. So I see you're not familiar as well, but it comes from the US. And I was speaking to an audience here at the US at Stanford University recently, and realized that they didn't know what mooning was. And it was quite funny, a South African telling them something that came out of their culture. But mooning is basically, let's say 20 people want to make the statement, stop climate change. So what they would do is, on their bum cheeks, they would write one letter each, and then at an appropriate time, they stand in order, they pull down their pants, and they all show their bums, and it'll spell the slogan, stop climate change, or whatever, right? Now, that as this tactic might work well in San Francisco, New York. It won't necessarily work well in India or
Yeah.
Indonesia or Saudi Arabia, for example, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that people using it in the context of the United States in a liberal city is wrong. It's right for there, but in another place it might not be. The other thing that we have to guard against, and I've been a supporter of Extinction Rebellion, since it's emerged from a distance, and I've participated in some of their protests and so on since. But I was not supportive of their activities in London in 2020 for some of the activities when they started blocking tube stations, right? Because who uses the tubes? It is working class people. And we need to win over working class people onto our side. And if we alienate them in that way, right, we are pushing them away from us. So, but then coming to the specifics of, firstly, it's really important to note that all of these things about young activists going and spraying things on the Mona Lisa or things like that, which gets the elite really riled up, right? Because wow, this is something. And how many people, let's be blunt about it, how many people in the world actually benefit from the Mona Lisa and that kind of art? It's not the majority of people. Majority of people in the world don't know that Mona Lisa exists, right? Even though we might think that everybody knows, the reality is it's not a big part. It's a way of saying to the elite, you are in a comfort zone, you are in a consumptive pattern that is actually contributing to climate change, and you need to wake up and smell the coffee. But important to note that the way sometimes the media reports on it, it's as if those young activists went there to destroy the Mona Lisa. When they've done all of these things can be wiped off and there's no permanent damage and so on, right? So it's not as if it's driven by a intention to be destructive. It's driven by intention to awaken up people to the fact that we are fast running out of time, right? And let's be clear. I get asked this question often, right? By audiences where they say, "Is it too late? Have we left it too late? Is it too late? And are we all going to die as a result of climate change?" And my answer is this: there is still a small window of opportunity, but that window of opportunity is fast closing, and it is our burden right now is to make sure we expand and open up that window of opportunity to save the majority of people on our planet from the worst impacts of catastrophic, irreversible, runaway climate change. Right? However, having said that, in my city of Durban, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, I beg your pardon, in 2 days, right, in the month of April, we had so much of rain, so much of infrastructure was destroyed, and 450 people plus in 2 days lost their lives. Right? We've never had anything on that scale before. Right? Up to today, years later, the infrastructure has not been rebuilt and so on. So let's be very clear. For those 450 people that died there, for the people that die in India from extreme climate events, and in similarly for people around the world, it's too late for them, right? So, so when we are seeing lives lost on the significant scale that they are, and so on, an action that seeks to arouse people from the slumber, especially the most powerful and the most influential people who have the capability to make the decisions to shift us from where we are, I don't think it is extreme action at all. And I do think, like it or not, it forces the issue onto the public conversation. Would I prefer that we didn't need to do that? Of course, I would prefer that young people didn't have to take those risks. Bear in mind, some of those young people who do that, they're risking prison time and so on, right? And let's be clear, my generation, right? I'm going to be 60 next year, right? My generation will not see the most brutal impacts of climate change. We are beginning to see impacts now. But young people, and that's why young people are so involved from India to Africa to Latin America. Young people are the backbone of the climate justice movement today, right? And why? Is because they understand that they're going to pay the failure of adult political and leadership that is needed at this point, which is just so lacking in so many places around the world. So yes, I prefer we didn't need to do that, and young people didn't need to take the risk. But I think that it is in the scale of things. If we don't address climate change with boldness and seriousness and with courage soon, not only the Mona Lisas, but every creative piece of art sitting in every museum of the world is at the risk of being wiped out as a result of extreme weather events engulfing it. So, in that sense, it's a justified action, provided the intention is not to permanently destroy.
Right. You're someone who's done where you sat in a room with the likes of Tony Blair, Putin, and Angela Merkel. And also, like you said, you scaled an oil rig, been at the grassroots movement in demonstrations. In your viewpoint, what has been more meaningful or impactful to send the message across?
This is such a good question. And let me just say that right now, I am reflecting on the question of how can activism win bigger and faster. And I must be honest with you to say that this is also a moment where there's no space for us individuals thinking about what is my legacy and, how am I seen and so on. We just need brutal honesty right now, because what is at stake is our, and people must realize that the struggle is not about saving the climate, saving the planet, saving the environment. The planet really is fine. Okay, the planet does not need saving. Let me say what I mean by that. If we continue on the suicidal trajectory that we're on, the end result is we destroy our water sources, we destroy our soil, the temperature warms up so much that our crops will get burnt, as is happening in Africa already in certain parts. The end result is we will be gone as a species, the planet will still be here. So everybody who's worried about saving the planet, don't worry. Because once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. We have to understand that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing more and nothing less about protecting our children and their children's futures, right? And so let me be very self-critical here. One of the biggest errors I've made is rooted in the question that you have just posed. And that is, I, like many others, mistook access for influence, right? So just because we had access to those in power, got into the room to tell them what we were concerned about, them nodding their heads in enthusiastic agreement most of the time. Most of the time, they don't disagree with you. They say, yes, yes, no, we're on the same page and so on. And then once you walk out of the room, it's business as usual, right? So today, young people dismiss this as handshake activism, right? And so I'm inspired by a West African anti-colonial leader called Amilcar Cabral, who once said, tell no lies and claim no easy victories. And where we are, let's just say what's really had an impact. So I'm not saying that as a principle, I'm saying people should not engage with government leadership or corporate leadership, something which I've done huge amounts of. But when I do a auditing of what the return on that investment is, I have to say the results are rather poor. Because you know what happens, and yeah, let me give a reflection, right? If I think of my meeting with any head of state or any minister or any CEO of a big company, 99% of the time, especially with people in government, leaders in government, when you walk into the room, they know what I'm going to say. I know what they're going to say, right? Because, we got briefing documents, right? Right? My colleagues have figured out, okay, on this issue, they're going to shift maybe a little bit on this, maybe not at all. They locked in. Politician X is beholden to corporate people who own big interests in oil, coal, and gas, and they might nod their head, but in the end, they're going to respect more the owner of a particular oil company, for example, or the coal company, for example, and they won't do what's in the interest of the people, right? So what happens is it becomes a ritualistic exercise. The people that you're meeting on the government side, whether it's the president of Mexico or whether it's a junior minister, right? They're ticking off a box saying civil society consulted. We are ticking a box saying government lobbied against, right? And but we walk out of the meeting and largely nothing changes, right? So having said that, I'm not saying that we should never engage with government and business leadership, but I think the proportionality of it is wrong, that our gaze should be less towards those that are powerful but more towards those that are powerless. Because as long as activism cannot show that the powerless is 100% behind them, those meetings will not have the impact that it needs to have, because those who have power are going to say, okay, influential organization, but they don't have sufficient numbers and sufficient, popular constituency behind them. So unless we can make sure that when those meetings happen and those engagements happen, you are visibly and tangibly speaking for a significant constituency, I don't think we make the progress that we need to make.
Okay. As a single person, as an individual, I feel pretty powerless in when with the climate crisis. So, what would your message be to individuals on how they can incorporate, issues of climate crisis in their daily lives? How can they contribute?
Well, firstly, let me say that I think this is the most important question of our conversation for this reason. The way we have defined activism is itself problematic, right? We have to be able to say that for the scale of change that we are needing to ensure that we are in a climate safe world, right? That we need the participation of people on a scale that we have never imagined before, right? And to do that, we cannot frame sort of who is an activist as people who might work for an organization like Amnesty and Greenpeace, or who might work for a faith-based organization, a religious organization that has a social program or a trade union and so on. Far too often, we actually do a framing of who is an activist and what is activism that actually excludes the majority of people. And I've been working on precisely this issue now for the last couple of years. And I've developed a sort of one-page infographic, which I can share with you as well, which is called People's Pathways to Climate Justice, right? And you see, activism starts off with how people are oppressed, marginalized, excluded, socially, repressed, and so on. And sometimes I think what happens is activism leadership actually imagines that because that's the starting point, they think that people have much less agency than in reality they still actually have, notwithstanding historically all the injustices from slavery, colonialism, and so on that people have experienced. But still, people still have considerable amount of agency to make a difference in their own right and acting in concert with other people. So there are multiple ways that which people can participate. So in this People's Pathways, I identify a range of different ways. So if you're a teacher, say, right, and you're not being involved in the climate movement and so on, and you're an art teacher, say, right, use that skill. Do what you enjoy doing. Do murals with the kids in your school, in communities with messages around climate change. If you're a banker, right, or work in the banking industry, think about how you can advise people on and work with people to make sure that the banking institutions are not lending to oil, coal, and gas projects, but are lending to clean energy projects, to sustainable agriculture, community farms, and so on. So, but what I would say is, for example, recycling is usually one of the first things you say that people can do, and thinking of one's own personal carbon footprint is a good place to start, right? As I've often said, recycling is a good place to start, but a very bad place to end, right?
In fact, of lately, there's been a discussion how, the fossil fuel industry has tried to change the narrative by putting the focus on the consumers, saying you need to recycle, you need to walk more. But in actual reality, individual recycling or walking more is not going to amount to that much as the fossil fuel industry actually changing their policies.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. And, you know, even if half the world took certain individual actions themselves, right, that they are able to take, right? The majority of us don't want to drive in a car or go in a bus that's powered by a energy source that's killing our children's future, right? We would rather be on electric vehicles or, and cleaner options. So we cannot be blamed for the fact that even though large numbers of people have been asking for alternatives and the alternatives have been denied, by the people that are part of the fossil fuel industrial complex, right? And people must understand the leadership of the fossil fuel industry today throughout the world is tantamount and equal to the leadership of the slave industry in an era gone by, right? Because they know the damage that they're causing, they know the injustice of it, and they insist because they are making so much profit from the current system, right? That they will not change. Now, the difference that we are having right now is no senior leader of any fossil fuel company says that climate change is a hoax or climate change. In fact, the only last person on the planet that's saying that is Donald Trump, right? No, really, there's no even head of state who's actually saying that, you know, that climate change is not a real threat. Everybody acknowledges it. But because they acknowledge it doesn't mean it's lip service. They don't make the changes that. So even the leaders of the fossil fuel companies, they are now saying, yes, we know we have to change. But what is the difference between them and us? They want to drag out as long as possible the phase out period, right? They recognize that it has to phase out, but they wanted to drag it for as long as possible. And that's going to be completely suicidal for us. But let's just pause for a moment and just ask ourselves this question, assuming for a second that oil, coal, and gas, fossil fuels, did not contribute to the problem of climate change, right? Let's just assume that, even though it's the main driver. Should we as a species bank on oil, coal, and gas, even if it wasn't a threat to climate? I would argue no, because we live on a finite planet, right? And on a finite planet, these things, oil, coal, and gas, are finite. They're going to run out at some point, right? So it makes absolute no sense when we have alternatives. So what we need to be doing is getting serious about building a society where our economy is driven not by dirty brown fossil fuel based energy, but by clean, green, renewable based energy. And what's nice about that is that if we do it right, we can not only get a win for the environment, but we also get a win for the economy and for job creation, because multiple studies have shown that the job creation potential of making this transition on a serious basis, right, will create a explosion of jobs. So, for example, in virtually every country around the world, we need to retrofit our buildings, right? That could be a big boost, to make them more energy efficient. That could be a big boost to the construction industry, for example. Like that, we can go industry by industry and show that actually a transition. Of course, the bosses of the fossil fuel industry and the big shareholders in the fossil fuel industry that have been making exploitative profits on the back of the people, they might lose out. But the vast majority of people on the planet won't.
Yeah. With regards to climate urgency, a movement that really needs to, like you said, the time is now to act. Yet it's crawling at a snail's pace. What can be done to expedite it? How can we engage people more? Why aren't they as invested as with, say, racial issues or gender issues?
Because we have put climate in a box called environmental issue. And you worry about climate if you are concerned about the environment. We have to break that, because climate is a failure of our economic system, transport system, energy system, food system, and so on. If we look at, the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and COVID, right? Both those crises showed the vulnerability of the vast majority of people on the planet, the inequality that exists, the injustice in our economic systems and so on that exists. It showed it very clearly. And it was acknowledged by governments, both in the global south as well as in the global north. It was acknowledged. But once those crises ended, what did we see? The propensity is for system recovery, system protection, and system maintenance. When what was needed after each of those crises, and especially what's needed right now, is not system recovery, maintenance, and protection, but what is needed is system innovation, system transformation, and system redesign. So we need to be thinking in much more systemic ways of change, right? And we have to be thinking about the fact, I say to people in the global north, right? If all of us in the global south were to enjoy the same consumption patterns that you folks take for granted in the global north, we'll need between 5 and 8 planets to do that. So we have one planet. We need to redefine our notion of if, in fact, even what constitutes a meaningful, happy, and good life, right? And I'll tell you, the worst disease that humanity suffers from is not COVID or influenza or anything else. It's a disease I call affluenza, right? Where people have been led to believe that a good, meaningful, decent life comes from more and more and more material acquisition. Because I think it's actually a sickness. It really is a sickness that people can accumulate on the scale that they do. And yeah, there's a very powerful set of words from Martin Luther King. When I was a couple months old as a baby, he said in a speech, my friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there is a very powerful term called maladjusted. Now, all of us want to be well adjusted and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well adjusted to. He then goes on to say, I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, to racial discrimination. And on the economy, he says, I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. So he was talking about the United States in the mid 60s. If that was relevant in the mid 60s in the United States, it's 1,000 times more relevant today in the US as well as globally, because this disease, as in a longer version of the speech, he says, I now call upon decent men and women around the world to come together to set up a new international organization to be known as the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. So basically, creative maladjustment is really about saying that which is the status quo, right? That which is being presented as normal, that it is normal for some people to have such fantabulous amounts of wealth and consumption, and that it's okay for the vast majority to have crumbs, is something that we never should have adjusted to. And not only is this bad for the people who are suffering exclusion and poverty, it's also terribly bad for the rich. Because if you look what's happening all around the world, you see the walls in the homes of the rich getting higher and higher, the security systems getting more sophisticated, and the level of their mental health is on a significant decline. So we have to shift the level of inequality that we see in the world, because it threatens both rich and poor in different ways, but equally fundamentally.
Yeah, well put. On an ending note, what are your plans for the coming year and what changes? I know you're at Stanford working on how climate justice and activism can be made bigger and better. So, in that regard, what are your plans for the coming year?
So there are two things that I'm particularly excited about that I've been working on for a while. Just next month, something that we've been working on for a long time is going to be launched at the United Nations, hopefully with the presence of the Secretary General. It's an initiative called Sounds Right. And Sounds Right, okay, let me ask you a trick question. Who was the first performer of music in the history of humanity? Do you know?
No.
It is a trick question. The answer is
Nature?
well done.
Okay.
Well done. Well done. So it's the sounds of, you know, birds and oceans and waterfalls and volcanoes and
The most
creeks
beautiful sounds.
sounds, right?
Yeah.
So basically, what we've done through an institution called UN Live Museum of the United Nations, whose board I serve on, and as part of a broader effort at energizing this idea of artivism, bringing the worlds of arts, culture, and activism together. So, Sounds Right is an initiative with Spotify and other streaming services, which reach billions of people, collectively, to encourage, and we've already got 100 musicians signed up, to use the sounds of nature in their music, right? So let's say Beyonce uses 3% of a song is using the sounds of nature, then 3% of the proceeds of the song will go into a fund to help indigenous peoples and people in frontline communities in their efforts to combat climate change. However, I should say this is not primarily a fundraising initiative. This is about meeting that 2 billion plus people who stream music, and because the songs will be designated as, for example, if I stay with the Beyonce example, it'll say Beyonce featuring nature, right? That's how the song will be. And we're saying it's high time nature was given the credit for their musical performance. So what we're hoping there is we can bring music lovers closer to the climate struggle, and we hope that will have that impact. Then later this year in September, from 5th to the 8th of September, and we hope many people in Asia will also participate actively, we are having the first inaugural Global Artivism Conference in South Africa. It's a global event where we are trying to, if you want, ensure that we are harnessing the power of arts and culture in the most just, ethical, and powerful way to to move large numbers of people into understanding, knowledge, and therefore, hopefully, thereafter into action. Because, as I say, this has to be about everybody. Unless every parent, every grandparent wakes up and smells the coffee and recognize that they are letting their children and grandchildren down by not standing up and cleaning up the mess that we actually allowed to happen around our watch, especially when you are seeing, so many young girls who are educated and understand what's coming, saying that they don't want to have kids and so on. When all of this is happening, we have to be creating the possibilities of people being able to participate. And I am an optimist. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, one of my heroes, who was one of the leaders of our liberation struggle in South Africa, he used to say, I'm proud to be a prisoner of hope, right? And let me end with this message. The moment of history that we find ourselves in is one in which pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our observations, and our lived experience can, must, and should be overcome by the optimism of our creativity, our thought, our action, and our courage. So this is not a moment for us to feel overwhelmed. We need to take a deep breath, recognize there's lots at stake, and don't let anyone tell you that you do not have the capability to contribute and make a difference, because that is the only thing that's going to save humanity on this planet. If people in massive numbers wake up and say, I'm not prepared to sit on the sidelines while my children and their children's future is being put at risk.
Yeah, that's very well said, Kumi. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you have any queries or feedback, you can reach me at maharanitalks@gmail.com or at Maharani Talks on Instagram. Take care.